Thank you so much for joining me for this video, which is about my initial experiences of filming fireworks with an iPhone. Whilst this is still very much a work in progress, I do have a lot of footage to share with you today, including both auto and manual, so I think it'll help move us towards settings which should produce good results. So press pause, go and put the kettle on and come back with a beverage of your choice and we'll get started, because this is a long one. Before we jump in, I'd like to say a quick thanks to UKFR's official sponsors. These are companies that support the running costs of both my videos and my online community. If you're in the UK and buying fireworks displays or firing systems, please check the link in the description to find out more about how these companies can help you and how you can get good deals on your pyro. The iPhone in today's video is my SE2, so this is not the current generation SE and very much the bottom rung of the iPhone ladder. The good news, however, is that if you like the footage you see today, then any more recent iPhone should be as good or better than this. Now, I'm not an expert on iPhone specs, but my understanding is that more recent generations of iPhone have slightly bigger sensors, a slightly wider aperture, and also optical as well as electronic stabilization. One really important caveat though, if you have a multi-camera iPhone and you're using the wide angle lens and you get worse results, it's the general consensus of YouTubers much more experienced with iPhones than me that the wide angle camera actually sucks compared to the main camera, so you may need to switch to the main rather than the wide camera for best results. Let's start this journey then with fully auto settings, not just fully auto and using the default camera app, but handheld too and with autofocus. I can't think of a more challenging situation for consumer camera gear, and my expectations here were very low. But what actually came out of this camera was pretty impressive. This is a semi-professional display at a Suffolk pub last year. I must admit I was expecting the footage to be a total car crash and be an example of why not to film in auto and handheld in the dark. But as you can see here, there's fireworks, they're stable, there's no jitters from the stabilisation, and things are reasonably sharp. If you look at this shot of the crowd, you can see how stable the footage is. You could almost believe this was done on a tripod. Though, if you look at the lens flare here, you can see how much it's shaking. This really does bring home how much work the phone is doing in smoothing things out. I was holding the phone up like this above my head. I can't show you with my phone because I'm using it for filming, so you have to imagine a phone in my hand. So the phone was shaking and moving in all directions, but even after over 10 minutes and getting progressively more shaky, it still did a great job. How did the autofocus do? Well, surprisingly good, possibly helped by the busy display, so there's always something in the frame. I can count on the fingers of one hand the times it lost focus, and even then it was quick to reacquire it. This is an example of black sky causing confusion and focus being lost, but it did acquire it again without any intervention on my part. Overall, really surprisingly good, and that footage is more than adequate for use on social media or sharing with friends. Can we improve on this footage though? Well, to answer that we need to look at the aspects of this footage that aren't quite so good. Let's start with the low-hanging fruit. This was filmed in 1080p, and I've since learned from trial and error that if you have 4K available on any camera system, use it. Even if, like me, you render out your final video as 1080p, doing this from 4K looks so much better than native 1080p from your device. Even on my Nikon mirrorless camera, the native 1080p looks noticeably worse than 1080p I've created from 4K in the editor. I hope that makes sense. I think in this clip it would have benefited from 4K, especially when scenery and the crowd were in the shot. Next, another low-hanging fruit is holding the phone and shaking quite badly. The more you move around with the phone, the more work it's doing to stabilise the footage, and I think this is going to have an impact on image quality. For hand holding, I recommend one of these. It's a phone bracket which you'll need anyway if you want to connect your phone to a tripod, coupled with a grip. If I can share some advice here, don't skimp on price and quality of this bracket. I've tried cheap plastic ones and they're useless. This one is made of metal. It's called an R cock. If I can find my Amazon order details, I'll put a caption on the screen. All of the axes in this can be locked off. There's some good friction with the forwards and backwards tilting, and it's got plenty of tripod attachments as well, and a cold shoe on the top. This is going to be useful for a microphone. The grip is just the cheapest I could find because all it has to do is screw into this bracket. The best option, of course, is a tripod, so you can then switch stabilization off completely. But here we do come into a catch-22 with phones and filming. It's the fact that if you're going to take a tripod to a display with you, why not just take a complete mirrorless camera and be done with it? Because if you've got the bulk of a tripod, why not just go with a full camera? The allure of a phone for me is the fact that it's the ultimate stealth camera. You can put it in your pocket. These holders will also go into a pocket or a bag. That said, assuming you already have an iPhone and don't want or need to invest in a full dedicated camera, a tripod is a cheap accessory and a good way to improve your footage. Next, looking at the footage itself, I would observe a few things that are probably more obvious to me looking at the source files on my laptop than they might show up on YouTube. The colours are pretty awful. It's almost as if the whole footage has been through the washing machine by mistake. All very pale, quite yellowy, and almost a complete lack of blue showing. This is likely to be the white balance, which we can take manual control over and see if we can get better results. Next is the ISO. Looking at the short trails made by the firework effects here, I'm guessing the shutter speed is quite fast, maybe 1/100th of a second or quicker. This will be a requirement of smooth stabilization, but it means the iPhone exposure is increasing by pushing the ISO up. Whilst on consumer gear like this, you do start to see some noise visible. The most usual side effect of high ISO is in fact the general smudging of the image caused by aggressive noise reduction. Things look increasingly muddy, especially in difficult areas like smoke. So taking manual control of ISO and keeping it on the low side should help. Finally, locking focus on manual should remove any focus jiggles. So this all leads us then to a manual intervention and taking over the phone's video settings. For manual control, I'm using an app called Filmic Pro. This is a paid app and I bought it some time ago, not actually for fireworks shooting, but for manual control of overhead desk shots. It's especially useful here because you can remote monitor the footage on an iPad with a companion app called Filmic Remote. So it made sense for me to continue to use this app for fireworks shooting. It offers full manual control and it is widely regarded as one of the better video apps. And you will need an app of some kind. The default camera app on iPhones, at least on mine, really doesn't allow you to manually control much or fine-tune the settings. Okay, for the first footage then, I'm guessing at some settings I think should work okay. I'm using 4K 25p for the video. I shoot most of my videos in 25p, so having a consistent frame rate is important to me for mixing footage later. But if you want to use a different video frame rate, feel free to. The shutter speed is 1/25th of a second, which I know to some people seem a little slow when we have the option for faster shutter speeds, but with an awful lot of fireworks footage behind me, I find 1/25th of a second produces nice smooth results, though I will be tweaking this later in the video to see what happens. For white balance, I'm picking 3211. If there's one thing about Filmic Pro that's total pants, it's the awful slider for the white balance. It's so inaccurate on a small screen. So this was intended to be 3500 or 3000, but I gave up trying to get it exactly there and I left it at 3211K. This setting, by the way, is from my previous tests on mirrorless cameras that shows 3500 Kelvin or thereabouts, keeps the blues looking nice and still allows other colours to come through. But White balance is very subjective and you may prefer warmer footage, so adjust that to suit. Again, I'll be tweaking this a little later in the video so we can see what happens there. Finally, for ISO, I'm starting off at 360. The minimum I can set on Filmic Pro on this iPhone is 22 and the maximum is 880. So that's quite a bit different to the range on a mirrorless camera, for example. Let's take a look at this footage then. This is a display I did for a friend's birthday party. We're starting with Fountain, Zeus's excellent crazy cone. This is silver to gold to crackling, so it has a bit of everything in. Note here how we're out of focus at the start. With a completely empty garden, there was nothing to focus on before the display started, so I had to wait until the fountain got going and then tap on that on the screen. But once locked in, it was fine for the rest of the display. With the fountain going well, you can see that noise is fairly low, sharpness is good. I think the fountain looks nice here even with 1/25th shutter speed. The shaking in this video is entirely as I had the tripod quite loose in order to allow panning up. It does mean that natural shaking of my arm is evident in this footage. That's user error on my part. I should have tightened it off a bit. That said, being on a tripod means that even with stabilization off, it's not jittering about too much. However, it is overexposed. It didn't look as bright as this to the eye, so we can get an idea then already that perhaps 360 ISO is too high. Moving on to the candles, pairs of Celtic's Hong Kong candles here, 2 pink first. Again, these look great, if a little overexposed too. So I'm going to switch the ISO now down to 200. The blue one's next. It's not an intense blue, but even so, I thought the blue was quite faded in this footage compared to real life. That aside, I thought the detail and the quality of this footage was more than adequate. Now to the finale cake, which was Angry Heidi from Firework Crazy. It's a brilliant long duration small bore cake that ironically didn't impress as much at their demo night, but for this smaller garden and with dogs in the audience, yes, you heard that right, there were 2 dogs watching and they thoroughly enjoyed it. The brief was not overly loud and this worked well to give a bit of noise without getting too leery. I'm pleased with these results. It's not too much underexposed or overexposed. It looks smooth, the colours look nice, but the blue just isn't coming out still. And stressing here that all the footage in this video is directly from the iPhone with no post-production done. So there's no cropping, no sharpening and no colour enhancements. Though bear in mind the footage is recompressed when I edit it for this video and YouTube will recompress it again before you see it. Usually you'll do lots of tweaking afterwards to improve colour and so on. So you're seeing it exactly as it comes off the phone. An interesting point, I filmed this with a GoPro 2 for my next video, which is about GoPro settings, and using a similar white balance, the blues from the GoPro looked amazing, so it's not the firework that's at fault here. I would have been tempted to call it a day with these settings because they've produced reasonable results, but I was curious as to why the blue looks so rubbish and whether this could be fixed with a change of white balance or exposure, for example with the shutter. So next up then we have Trafalgar's wonderful handheld flares with a blue one being fired. I'm starting at 2800 Kelvin white balance, which is the lowest you can go on Filmic Pro on my iPhone. Actually, this wasn't a great firework to test these settings with, though at 2800 you can see the edges of the flame and the smoke do look nice and blue. I whisked through various settings clumsily on the awful white balance slider, right up to the maximum setting of 10,000 or 9999 as my finger slipped. This looks truly awful, though it's almost as if you're looking through a yellow filter. but bear in mind that the fountain ending of the flare had also kicked in by this point as well. Let me put these up as stills. Side by side you can have a better view here of how the blue fades as you warm up the white balance setting. If we've learned anything here, then it's that having a white balance setting of 10,000 will probably ruin your day. Next I wanted to test whether decreasing exposure by using lower ISO or faster shutter speeds would make the blue come out any better. I'm starting here with the minimum ISO of 22 and white balance is back to the coolest of 2800. Well, it looks nice and blue, but it's also filmed from further back, which I think helps. As I increase the ISO first to 167, then 367, then 569, then 880, the flame doesn't really change that much, nor does the blue, but it does cause the surroundings to show up more. Increasing the ISO a lot then really doesn't do an awful lot, unless you want specifically for surroundings like your gardens or a crowd, for example, to show up. And you probably won't notice it so much on YouTube, but the noise and mushiness of the image did increase as the ISO went up. When the bright fountain ending of the flare started, I then switched the ISO right back from maximum to the minimum of 22, and even then the exposure is bright, which really does confirm that the right exposure is dependent on how bright the firework is, at the risk of stating the blindingly obvious. If we take a freeze frame of the fountain at 1/50th of a second shutter and ISO 22, you can see how clean and sharp the image is. Notice too that there is still some motion blur on the sparks, which helps to give a sense of movement. 100th of a second shutter now, and still with ISO at 22, to my eyes, and your mileage may vary here, but the sparks now look too small. There's no trails on them as such. The end result for me is a mash of dots, which I think looks worse. Finally, to end the video, I'm going from 100th shutter to 1/50th to 1/25th, so you can see the difference this makes. I do like 1/25th of a second, but perhaps 1/50th offers the best compromise between sharpness and allowing some trails to show, giving the impression of movement. Here's a side-by-side image showing how the doubling of shutter times also doubles the lengths of the trails left by the sparks. Next, I wanted to try filming something with coloured blobs in, ideally including blue, to see if we can fine-tune the settings any further. For this, I'm using the excellent, almost silent Fireflies fountain from Zeus Fireworks. A big thanks to the team at Dynamic and Firework Emporium for putting aside a few of these fountains for me to test fire. The fireflies I filmed were all predominantly blue and red stars. There was an occasional single fleck of green. I don't know if there's variations in colours across different batches or different years of manufacturer, but these look different to me than their stock footage, though they could have filmed that in a different white balance setting, of course. Either way, as I specifically wanted blue to try out the white balance, this worked well for me. Okay, first up then we have 1/50th of a second shutter, ISO 22 and white balance 2800. I'm afraid this is out of focus as I was operating 3 cameras at the time for other videos that I'm doing, and I didn't notice it messed the focus up. Despite this, I think we can agree it's too dim. The blues look better, but the red is too jaded. So for the second test, I'm going to use 1/50th of a shutter still, but ISO 200, and I'm going to put the white balance up to 3486, which is the closest I could get the infernal slider to 3500. This, I think, is the best footage of the fountain from the ones that I filmed. The exposure is better. I probably wouldn't want to go much higher than this ISO-wise, unless I wanted more of the garden to show up. The blue is okay, the red looks better, the flecks of green look okay too. In case you're wondering, I filmed this with both a GoPro and my mirrorless camera too, with similar white balance settings, and both of those cameras showed super intense blue colours. So by this point I have to conclude that my specific iPhone is not that good at showing blue firework effects. For test 3, I'm dropping the ISO down to 102, a white balance of 2800 still. I'm persevering with that for a little bit, keeping the shutter speed at 1/50th of a second. This resulted in reasonable exposure again, so I'm leaning towards 100 to 200 ISO being a good range to use. The blue is fine, but at the expense of the red, so I think all said and done, I'm not really that keen on 2800 as a white balance setting. Blue's better, everything else worse. Final test now, and this is an interesting one because it's full auto. So I'm switching back to the iPhone's built-in camera app and leaving it to do its stuff. At first glance, this looks great because so much more of the garden is lit up. However, this footage does not bear up to close scrutiny. The increased exposure is entirely down to bumped up ISO. We can see that because the trails left by the sparks are quite small, indicating maybe a 100th or similar shutter speed. This means things quickly start to look really murky and mushy. The colours are not great either. I think the white balance is wandering during shooting. At times the blue shows okay, other times it doesn't show at all. Overall it looks a little bit too warm and a bit too red to me. Let's put these side by side, and I think for me the manual settings on the left have the edge, save perhaps for the white balance possibly benefiting from going a bit warmer, but the image is clear and the colours are consistent through the footage. Okay, if your head is spinning from all of this, don't panic, I have a summary coming up. To sum this up then, starting with full auto, yes, the iPhone does a good enough job. You may lose focus a few times, the colours might be a bit off, and in some of the footage, overexposure with the ISO might reduce the image quality. But film in 4K and hold the phone steadier with something like this and you'll help things along. The fact that this can even film at all handheld in the dark is pretty amazing for consumer camera tech. I do think that for most people, auto mode is fine for fireworks. You'll get reasonable results which are good for sharing on social media and with friends. Can you improve things in manual? Yes, I think so. My favourite footage actually from all of these tests was Filmic Pro using 1/25th of a shutter speed, 25p video, ISO 200 and white balance of around 3,500. With Filmic Pro you can then lock your shutter and drag in the ISO slider from the left of the screen and use that as you adjust exposure up or down as needed. You probably won't need to go much above 300 ISO unless there's some fine gold effects or you particularly want the surroundings to show up. Another shutter option is 1/50th if you prefer motion trails on your fireworks to look a little shorter. An advantage of using 1/50th of a second is that that will play nicely if you intend later to shoot 50p video too. If you prefer to shoot in 30p, then adjust these settings accordingly. So 25p becomes 30p, 50p becomes 60p, 1/25th of a shutter becomes 1/30th, and so on. Now, I know some of you are going to ask this, is it better to shoot in 50p rather than 25p? Well, I have done some 50p shooting already. I can't show you the results in this video because it's rendered in 25p, so it would take it down to 25p, so it all makes it a little bit pointless. But 50p footage at 1/50th of a second shutter with the same ISO and white balance settings that you've seen in this video, from my initial shooting, looks really nice. It's buttery smooth. I think that's probably the way forward. However, 50p does have its disadvantages in other ways, such as file size and so on, so it won't be suitable for everyone. I will say too that not all devices support 4K at 50p. Some will max out at 1080p 50p and 4K at 25p. In those cases, in my testing, I found that it's better to prioritise resolution over frame rate. So 4K 25 would be the option I'd pick over 1080 50p. So there you have it then, a starting point for Filmic Pro. I think you'll get good results doing this. It's 25p video, 1/25th or 1/50th of a shutter speed. If you're unsure which one of those to pick, then go for 1/50th because the look of your footage will be similar if you then later start shooting in 50p. White balance, entirely subjective. I'm using 3,500 or so, but it won't harm things making a little higher to warm things up. I wouldn't go above say 5500 though, because things start to yellow out at those sort of settings. And for ISO, 200 I think is a good starting point, and use the ISO slider in Filmic Pro to change this up or down as needed during filming. Based on all of this, can we improve things even further? Well, I think 50p will be the next footage for me to test and report back with. I also think that recent iPhones will be a lot better than my old SE2, particularly with regards to how it comes out with the blue colours. But as always, as I've said many a times, firework footage is so very subjective, so you may well look at my settings, the recommended ones today, and want to tweak them. But I hope the variety of the footage that I've provided today will at least point you in the right direction. Things not covered in this video include audio. This is massively important, especially if it's windy. I will be back in a future video with some suggestions and testing for this. Also, whether filming in ProRes and some of the high-end video codecs on the latest iPhones will make any difference at all, particularly if your target audience is YouTube or social media. That's something that will have to wait for me to upgrade my phone to test, however. There are also saturation and vibrance sliders in Filmic Pro, which I haven't used yet. I do think the footage in this video that you've seen will definitely benefit from pushing the colour saturation up. So if you looked at the videos and thought, you can see colours in the fireworks but they're not that bright, usually what you do is in the video editor you'd put the saturation or vibrance up. My thinking here though is that anyone serious enough to use Filmic Pro to take manual control is probably at the level of editing video footage afterwards anyway. In that case, using your video editor to tweak the colours is better than baking it into the footage itself. Finally, a word about ghosting and flaring, which is one of the most complained about annoyances when using iPhones to film at night. It's obvious when filming oncoming headlights, for example, at night, or the bright lights of fun fairs and so on. But it's also quite clearly evident when you film fireworks footage too. If you take a look at this footage, which I'll freeze to start with and highlight the ghosting, these are a mirror image. So an equal and opposite of any bright points in your footage. As bright fireworks shoot up, their reflection will shoot down the screen. And here with a bright fountain, there's an equal and opposite ghost effect. Does this bother you? Well, it's very subjective again. I've got used to it, but I do feel as this is a hardware issue caused by the lens with no obvious workaround, then I think potentially for professional use, it most likely rules iPhones out until the future version fixes this. For more information about ghosting, there's actually loads of YouTubers into cinematic night shooting with iPhones. If you search for YouTube, you'll find a lot more help from them. It really bugs them, this ghosting. It's the most requested thing that they want fixed on an otherwise stunning camera system. Strangely, my GoPro doesn't do this, despite having a separate removable lens cover. Well, that's all from me. I hope you found this video useful. I will be back soon with similar tests using a GoPro so we can go through all of this again. But those results are very interesting, particularly comparing footage of identical fireworks side by side with my iPhone. But for now, that's all from me, and I will say goodbye. Goodbye.